It's a great pleasure to be here and to have this topic front and centre in the conference agenda. I want to pay tribute also to the organisers for not starting on fake news, but starting on history, which I think is a much better jumping off point. And I'd also like to say that is the only time that we are going to hear the word fake or the term fake news used in the discussion today. It was very well pointed out at the breakfast session today that fake news is not a useful term, so please don't use it in either from the panel or from the floor. Our topic is democracy and digital misdeeds, fighting foreign manipulation. And there were just a couple of things that came up in the discussion this morning that I wanted to share with you. It was one of the breakfast discussions. One was the idea that the realization of Russian capabilities in this is equivalent to the Soviet atom bomb test of 1949. And that's a very interesting idea because certainly that was a huge watershed. But I think I disagree with it because actually these capabilities have been on display in this part of the world for many, many years. And the Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians are often too polite and modest and kind to say so, but I can say it, that if this whole problem is a new problem, it's not because it's actually new, it's because you weren't paying attention. I lived here from 1990 to 94, and in the midst of the Soviet collapse, we saw these tactics at work, and we saw them in the early years after the Soviet collapse, when everybody else was saying, isn't everything just fine? And it's absolutely true that the digital side has changed everything. It's brought anonymity, ubiquity, and immediacy of a kind that we didn't have back then. But the fundamental idea that you can use information and money and other tactics from the hybrid warfare toolbox to manipulate politics in another country, that is categorically not new. Maybe new to some countries, but it's not new because we saw it here. The other thing that, of course, came up this morning was the case of Arkady Babchenko in Ukraine, and I'm sure we're going to spend plenty of time on that. But I'd like us to try and keep that a little bit towards the second half of the discussion. This is not a session about whether the Ukrainians did the right thing or the wrong thing, and whether the reaction and the criticism is justified or unjustified. This is a session on a much broader topic. So I'd like to concentrate on the broad stuff first and save Babchenko to later. The panel here is, I think, the ideal mixture to talk about this. And I'm going to introduce them all very briefly, and then we'll get on to the get onto the discussion. So we're going to kick off with Mark Galeotti, who has been following this subject for many, many years, and is the author of an excellent new book called Vori. Those of you who are not Russian speakers in the audience, this is one of the Russian words you need to know. It means thieves. And it's a really excellent account of Russian organized crime and the way that the outside world has tried to deal with it, both pointing out the dangers of alarmism and of complacency. And so Mark is going to kick us off. Then we have Andrei Soldatov. And if you haven't read Red Web, you should read it. If you've read the old edition, you should read the new edition, which has an extra chapter. It's an excellent account of how Russian intelligence works. Andrei and his wife Irina are the world experts, I would say, in this. And if you don't already look at their website, agentura.ru, then do make a point of looking at it. Daniel Moore is principal at Accenture iDefense, and also writing a PhD at King's. And I can exclusively reveal that his PhD thesis has the most fantastic title, provisional title, he insists, but it's already very good, which is From Spectre to Spectrum, Military Cyber Operations. So the PhD is not yet finished, the book is not yet published, the title is not yet finalized, but please put it on your list to read soon. And then finally we have Arndt Freitag von Löringhofen, who is a very distinguished German public servant, but now the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO. He has not written a book, so I can't urge you to buy it, but please do pay your taxes and encourage your governments to spend 2% on defense. if they don't already. And his brainchild, or his project, is that it's a new division in NATO which exists since 2016, and even the fact this division has been set up sends a powerful message, let alone the stuff it's actually doing, and it is the Joint Intelligence and Security Division. So we're going to kick off with Mark to give us a big picture, then we'll have Andre giving it looking from a Russian point of analysis, I wouldn't say from a Russian viewpoint, then Daniel to talk about more about the technical side, and then Arndt is going to explain. I originally said why NATO can't save us, and he was very cross about that and said how NATO will save us, but NATO's role in defending from this. Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Well, hello, delighted to be here. Just as a sort of brief initial orientation, not so much for where we've been, but what we're going to face, I really want to talk about, when it comes to the Russian political war, three specific spectra. Again, that's obviously the word of the panel. A spectrum of intent, a spectrum of instruction, and a spectrum of instrument. Intent, let's start with that. What are the Russians after? I mean, I think it's fairly clear that there is this campaign to, I hesitate to say, make Russia great again, but certainly force the West, the outside world, to consider Russia to be a great power in a very, frankly, 19th century geopolitical notion of what a great power is. A great power has a sphere of influence. A great power is involved in all global issues of moment and has a voice, and by voice they mean veto. And also, a great power has, shall we say, exemption from those irritating international norms and laws that might get in the way. So, in order to do that, because this is not, after all, a campaign of territorial expansion, I don't believe the Russians have any such intent. This is, in some ways, about political expansion instead. To do that, when you have a country that is clearly not a great power in any terms other than your capacity to blow up the world with your nuclear arsenal, which is not inconsiderable, but let's face it, a rather limited in value. Therefore, we have this extraordinary multi-vectored campaign being waged against the West, either, and in this respect it is the geopolitics of the extortionist, either to reach a stage where we will just make a deal with Russia just to get Russia off our backs. I mean, some kind of Yalta 2.0 would be his ideal, both in terms of what he would get from it, but also from the fact that it would make Putin look like an equal interlocutor. Or just failing that, just simply to disrupt us, to divide us, to dismay us, to leave us in no position to be able to assert the kind of unified, combined, and determined resistance that is going to be needed. So, given that we cannot and should not give Mr. Putin what he's after, we are basically in this situation, in my opinion, for as long as Putin is in the Kremlin. So, I mean, I think one of the problems is we have to accept that although there is scope for modulating the scale of the challenge, the essence is what we have seen yesterday is what we will be seeing tomorrow and what we'll be seeing next year, and so on, and so long as Putin is there. So we have a spectrum of intent in the sense that there is not one very, very specific and achievable goal. There is a constant and, frankly, in this context, never-ending struggle to undermine and dismay us and divide us. Moving into the spectrum of instruction, it's easy and it's a convenient cliche to think of Putin as the chess player. I'm sure we all realize that he's not this sort of grand master supervillain. Instead, what we see is something that is exceedingly opportunistic, but, and this is one of the problems for us, it covers a whole range of different sources. There are clearly operations that are absolutely planned and managed in Moscow, particularly brokered through the presidential administration that is, after all, probably the last really powerful institution left in Russia as the voice of Putin's court. But most of the operations we face are not only opportunistic, they're also often driven by local actors. An individual station chief of intelligence in an embassy, or an ambassador, or a particular journalist, or news outlet, or oligarch, or minigarch, or whatever, who are acting either on the request of the Kremlin, on the nod and a wink hint from the Kremlin, or just a belief that that is what the Kremlin wants. One of the most important attributes for a rising official in Putin's Russia is the capacity to read Putin's brain tomorrow. So often it is actually in this respect, a case of political entrepreneurs coming up with ideas, pitching them to Moscow, or even just launching them themselves. So this is the problem we face. We have everything from the carefully structured, centralized, coordinated campaigns, all the way through to large amounts of stuff happening, which is very hard to predict. And third and final spectrum is one of instrumentation. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there is no such thing as a Gerasimov doctrine. There is no such thing as any kind of grand plan for disruption or whatever. Actually, although there is clearly sort of information warfare doctrines and so forth, actually, if you look at how the Russians operate, it is phenomenally opportunistic. It is, what opportunities do we see? What instruments do we have? What actually will do the job best? Today, it may well be some, I couldn't, of course, use the F word, fake, but some piece of disinformation. It might just as easily be some business person putting money into a particular strategic investment, or it could just easily be gangsters being told to kill some Chechen fundraisers in Turkey. But the point is, again, we have a spectrum of instruments that are driven not by any grand plan, but by the needs of the moment. So what does this mean for the future? And this is the last thing I want to say. What this means is essentially we have to accept several things. One is we are in for a long haul until whatever, fortuitousness, Botox, or whatever, takes Putin out of the Kremlin. But without a very, very clear or achievable goal. To an extent, just simply ripping us down has become the goal. This is not something that is always going to be led from the Kremlin, but quite the opposite. This is actually a surprisingly decentralized system, deinstitutionalized system. So what we do is need to be considering what are the imperatives, what are the other actors who are playing a role, rather than just looking at what's going on in Moscow. And the third element is we should appreciate that if we concentrate too much on specific instrumentalities, that's fine, we close off particular tools. But the point is the Russians are imaginative and entrepreneurial souls, alas, and they will be constantly looking for new ones. So actually dealing with the instruments, while necessary, does not solve the problem.
Thanks very much, Mark, and I'm particularly pleased with that last of the many good points you made, because I think one of the problems we have is that it's a bit like driving a car looking through the rearview mirror, and we're getting better or maybe less bad at working out what it was that we just drove over. Was that a log? Was it a hole in the road? Was it whatever? But we're still not looking through the mirror, through the windshield, through the windscreen, at what's coming towards us. And I hope that we can keep the discussion forward focused in the time we have left. I also I think you're right to say that Russia is a nuclear superpower. But not only, I think you have to accept it, certainly a cryptographic superpower, one of only three or four countries in the world with that level of capability. And also, to be fair, a cultural superpower. Russian soft power doesn't rest on nothing. And I also, if I could just ask you one very quick question, is it really two different options when it comes to intent, or is it just two sides of the same coin? That the big aim is Yalta 2.0 and Russia's seat at the table. That's if you like, the strategic goal. But the tactics are the weaken the West wherever we can. Those two seem to fit together. I'm not sure. Does it make sense to try and put them as an either-or?
Oh no, I absolutely wouldn't regard them as an either-or. It's more that you might say these are the sort of, if you can't get a Yalta 2.0, then actually the best thing you can do is neutralize the West in a way so that Russia can impose the things that it wants. It would much rather that we sat down and said, Mr. Putin, you are one of the great poles of the world, by which I should stress a small p, before I get the entire population of Poland upset. But if he can't get it because we give it to him, he needs to disrupt us so he can take it.
Right. The other point, which we're just going to have to park, because this is not a session about Russia, it's a session about digital manipulation, is the question of whether it's right to assume that all our problems will be over when, as you put it, Putin finally succumbs to Botox. It seems to me that just as these problems predated Putin, it may well be that we have them with whoever comes next. But that's for another time. Andre, give us your take from how you observe the opportunistic culture of attrition towards the West in Russia.
Well, thank you, Edward, and thank you for having me here. And first of all, let me try to challenge a conventional wisdom, a notion that we got after 2016 that we are dealing with a very impressive, very adventurous, very sophisticated approach orchestrated by the Kremlin, and it's such an effective machine that we need to pay attention and we need to think how to counter it. And of course, it was very impressive. I mean, what we saw in 2016 in the United States, but there were some reasons why, specifically, we think it was so effective. One of them is that finally we got it that the Kremlin knows how to use proxies. And of course, it makes them much more dangerous, as we know that Russian bureaucracy, even security services bureaucracy, could be really slow. And now we got people, troll farms, some other guys, who are really fast and very flexible. In terms of digital security, it gives us this very big challenge of attribution. If you are dealing with proxies, it's even more difficult to attribute an attack to the state. Well, it's notionally low-risk, low-cost operation, as we are told. And to be honest, I think now in 2018, if we look at what actually happened after 2016, maybe it's not that impressive. Yes, we got these proxies, and they are quite effective, and they are acting along with Russian intelligence and security and the military intelligence agencies. But why we got them in the first, why the Kremlin got them in the first place? Because they are seen as a kind of fixers. We have, for many years, the Russian security and law enforcement and military had this problem of a very bad coordination. So if you have a battlefield in Chechnya, elsewhere, and you have information operation, it's extremely difficult to force all these people to coordinate their efforts. And first we got the administration of the president, then we got some pro-Kremlin youth movement, finally we got proxies like Trolls Farm, essentially to coordinate all these guys. But it was a very tactical solution. You are trying to fix a problem, but it doesn't mean that now, from 2016, you have this thing instituted as a part of institution. Does it mean that it would be there forever? Well, I probably would say probably not, especially because most of these proxy organizations were exposed by journalists in Russia and in the West. And you need to find new proxies and to find a new approach. Second thing is that operation was really that low-cost operation? Look at what happened to the FSB. Information Security Department of the FSB, in charge of all cyber things inside of the FSB, is in complete disarray. They lost, over the last 2 years, actually last year, they lost its chief. It was forced into retirement. It lost 2 deputy chiefs. Both of them were accused of some misgivings. One was sent to jail. Another one got 3 years in probation. Some of the officers were exposed, are still in jail. Some of them ended up on the FBI most wanted list. FSB, SVR, GRU facilities were closed down in the United States. They suffered a lot. So to say that it was that low-risk, low-cost operation, probably not. And probably it would affect the decision-making process in the Kremlin when they see, well, actually, it's not that effective at the end of the day. But there is one thing which we tend to overlook, and I think it's much more interesting and potentially it's much more important, is that because of 2016, we got the whole world, especially the United States, are talking the Kremlin language. But it was always this definition between cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and the terminology used by Western experts, and the Russian language. And they, from 1999, they wanted to talk about information security, information warfare. And after 2016, I got lots of American experts coming to me saying, basically, look, Andrei, Putin was right. It's not about cyber anymore. It's about information. We need to think about the content. And to be honest, I think it's an extremely dangerous approach because it means that we start treating, first of all, the media as soldiers, as units, as battalions in this war. And we got this, actually, back in 1999 because Russia back then was at war. We were at war in Chechnya, and Putin needed to sell the war to the public and to explain why we lost the first Chechen war. And he came up with a very sophisticated explanation. He said, we lost the first war because of journalists. Journalists, liberal journalists in Russia, journalists in the West, they undermined our war effort, and now we need to find a way how to deal with them. That's why we got the information security doctrine. And that became an essential part of the Kremlin thinking. Now they treat the media as warriors. They have their own warriors like RT, Sputnik, and you name them. And my problem is that it looks like we see more and more countries succumbing to this, accepting this approach. And it's the case of Arkady Babchenko, and I've known this guy for 12 years. We used to work together in Novaya Gazeta. He's a great guy. But nevertheless, the idea that you can use a journalist essentially as a soldier in your information operation, well, that's exactly what the Kremlin think about the journalist. And as a journalist myself, to be honest, I do not want to be treated as a journalist. I think it's a very...
You don't want to be treated as a soldier?
No,
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
I think it's such a bad idea because it's a very black and white world, and the Kremlin has, and Putin himself has this picture in his mind. Well, you have, you fought for your government or you fight against it, and there is no place for things like society, there is no things about accountability. Actually, if you're a soldier, you cannot hold accountable your generals. And it's completely compromised the whole thing about journalism. And in the short and long term, I think it could backfire. And we already see it. Some Kremlin trolls already say that, look, next time you show us pictures of MH17, we show you a picture of this dead journalist.
Yep. Thank you very much. You know, I think this is a really important question about whether, in defending ourselves against Putinism, we risk Putinizing ourselves. There's a real paradox here. It's almost kind of reflexive control, and particularly the way, as you say, the way in which this whole discussion has started shaping the lexicon, the language that we use to discuss this is all shaped by Russian assumptions or Kremlin assumptions and Kremlin terms, and it's very troubling, and we'll get onto that more in the discussion. And I also think you're absolutely right to highlight the danger that we build a kind of Stratcom industrial complex of people who make a living by being information warfare experts because they watch RT a lot and write papers about it. And we need to be careful about that too. Daniel, let me turn to you now. Give us a focus from we've barely talked about the digital side. It's been more on the information side. So give us the benefit of your expertise on this.
Sure, and thank you for having me here in the conference. This is actually my first time here, and I think it's an absolutely amazing crowd, so it's great to be here. And I want to build on what's been said before and maybe dispel a different aspect of the perception of how, for example, the Russian threat looks like to liberal democracies, and that's of this monolithic technical entity that's capable of achieving anything it set its mind to, where in fact what we actually see is rather than a single monolithic threat, you see a definitively diffused threat of very variable quality. And we see this throughout. And there was a fantastic conversation this morning about fake news and how we don't like this concept, and I definitely agree. And these disinformation campaigns are actually the perfect embodiment of the evolution of this threat. It is not static. It is not static. And I also liked what I believe Lisa said in the morning about spaghetti against the wall. It's kind of true. It is a form of spaghetti against the wall, almost in trying to make better spaghetti, which is weird, but it kind of works. And the reason why it works is because a lot of these operations have no meaningful consequence. So when we see a lot of these operations happening against campaigns and against actual societies, and you see these taking technical form, when you start pulling on the technical threads, you actually don't have to pull that hard in most of those cases. We see, for example, something that is normally not a part of what you would call operational security for technical operations like these against networks and information, is that they reuse the same capacities. They even reuse the same infrastructure that was exposed in previous times. Normally, if you are an intelligence agency that has an operational doctrine and a way of going about things, the first thing that you would do is replace that very thing that caused you to be detected the time before. But the thing is, it doesn't matter in this case. It just keeps working. And this is a perfect example of what you said. We're getting a bit better at looking back and saying, yes, we've seen this, and they use this and that, and we have better cooperation between the public and the private sector on facilitating identification of these threats and all that. That's great, but what do we actually do with it later on? And there are fantastic examples in Ukraine about how that comes to pass. So if you look at the evolving attacks against the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, if you look specifically at the energy sector, we are now looking at several consecutive years of overt targeting of elements of Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And that's incredible. This is what some countries, including Russia itself, define as a very defined boundary that you do not cross. Alongside, by the way, ironically enough, enshrined within their doctrine is the notion that you don't use digital attacks to impugn on a national sovereignty, which is somewhat ironic. But yes, but we've seen these operations over the last at least 4 years publicly, and we've seen them evolving from something that's fairly rudimentary and gradually accruing more and more expertise as they simply use that part of the infrastructure as their digital playground. It is almost like a firing range, which is the actual target that you then plan to use it against. And that is something that none of us in liberal democracies actually are doing. So if you look at a lot of what the United States and its allies do, when you prepare for this type of conflict, you train in a simulated environment, right? Because that's just how it works. But the amazing thing is that the type of dynamic that has been created between us and some of our adversaries is that they can just do this with relative impunity. So if we're talking about looking forward and what we can do, I think there's a few aspects to this. So from a more normative standpoint, I think we need less ambiguity. The cyber domain, or the information domain, as we often call it, often lends itself to a lot of ambiguity because it's less tangible, and so we tend to talk in more vague terms. I am just fresh off the heels of a great SciCon conference, and there was a conversation there, and it was said that that NATO purposefully does not declare what its threshold is for responding to a type of cyber attack. And my response to that is that that's not how you make deterrence, because deterrence demands clarity. Deterrence demands that the other side you have communicated to them that they know what boundary not to cross. And I ask you, what is that boundary? If we're seeing attacks against critical infrastructure, if we're seeing severe disruptions of national sovereignty multiple times, where is that boundary? Or maybe we should be doing a more concrete job at codifying this. All the way up to actually defining our actual terminology, what's an attack, and what's an intrusion, and what's a breach, and what's all that. So that's one of the areas where we can be doing better. And certainly, we can take those technical characteristics and do better at looking forward and implementing them, because we're definitely going to be seeing that evolving. We don't need to prepare for the technical challenges of the past, but rather for the ones of the future. And there are quite a lot of very interesting technologies that are coming out now, and it is only a matter of time until they start percolating to this operational sphere. At first, in a low quality, but gradually in a better capacity. So if you're talking, for example, about, they're talking a lot about deepfakes and what they can do. If we already have an issue with defining what truth is and what a fact is, So having something that can increasingly convincingly create video with people embedded in it, and you don't actually know if they took the video, raises some interesting question as to what type of narrative can be created in the future for information operations. So, and I know this is a controversial example, if we're talking about whether or not the tape exists, will it even matter at some point if we can create something that looks like the tape would have existed? And now go prove that it doesn't. So that's a type of challenge that's becoming increasingly more prominent. And we need to start proactively preparing for the technical challenges of the future.
Thanks very much. Well, I hope we can get a bit more into deep fakes and the AI and these other technical things a bit later on. In the discussion this morning, there was a very nice analogy that if you have a village where there's arsonists are burning down the houses, and they're good at burning down old houses and new houses and small houses and big houses, and like having little fires and big fires and using different sorts of techniques. Obviously, one thing you can do is to put fire extinguishers everywhere, install sprinklers, build your houses with fireproof material, have the fire brigade round every corner and so on. And that, those ideas are not inherently stupid, but there's a big question of why are you letting the arsonists get away with it? How about arresting the arsonists or deterring them in some other way? And that's where NATO comes in. NATO defends us in all sorts of ways. NATO has not only its old territorial defense mission, it engages in operations overseas, it's getting into the terrorism business and into different parts of cyber and information warfare. So NATO is becoming our kind of universal and comprehensive security organization. And we expect great things.
With this over to me, thank you very much. And let me start with a personal comment. It's my first time at this conference. I'm a so-called Baltic German. My ancestors lived in this country for hundreds of years, and I've been coming here for 30 years, since 1988, and it's wonderful to see what has become to this country, and also to enjoy being here at this conference. Let me be fairly brief. I won't add anything to the analysis. I very broadly share what has been said, and I also, unfortunately, expect this hybrid confrontation to go on for a long time. It's attractive for the adversary. It's low cost, high yield. Unfortunately, it will be even more tempting with technologies advancing, the possibility to fake not only texts but videos and audios, and the intent is there and probably not going to go away. So I think responses can be grouped under two headings: resilience and deterrence. Many of these are national obligations. Many of them should be done by an international organization such as NATO or also the EU. We all have a role to play in this. On resilience, there are many aspects, and we haven't talked about this. Let me just quickly enumerate some of them. We have to become better at understanding, analyzing the process. Question of attribution is very, very challenging when it comes to cyber attacks. Cyber security, cyber hygiene is a huge challenge. Education, perhaps the most important one. For instance, in the lead up to the American midterm elections or other European elections, we need to draw the consequences from previous elections and see what we can do better. And a good example of that was the French run-up election, which took some lessons learned from the US case in 2016 and immediately pushed back some of the leaked emails, so they didn't get much traction. Debunking fake news, sorry about that. That is an issue for the EU. It's an issue for NATO. There are also some positive examples here. I would cite the case of Lithuania, which from a German point of view, sometimes called the Lisa 2 case, the case of a young girl which was allegedly raped, in this case by a German soldier. That was immediately taken up by the Lithuanian press and debunked and didn't get traction. So a very nice example of the importance of a credible free press and for the necessity to stick by our principles, because it was clear which side was right. And then there's this whole debate about how to deal with the private sector, companies like Facebook and Twitter, engagement or regulation, very big questions for the future, which we all need to tackle. On deterrence, I would start by saying naming and shaming is a big issue. Here I could cite a German example. The German intelligence services issued very clear warnings to Russia not to meddle with the elections, and then that didn't happen. There's no very clear proof of the causality, but it looks like it has worked. So this is a lesson learned for others. Of course, there's a whole range of sanctions that can be applied and that are being applied: economic, visa bans, financial sanctions, and also on the higher end of the spectrum, more proactive tools such as offensive cyber tools are being developed, not by NATO, but by some nation states. And the big question will be to define the threshold, how and when to apply them. What can NATO do? As I said, many of the issues are national obligations, but we can help and facilitate and message. We can help by understanding the problem, by comparing notes, intelligence sharing. That's what my division is doing. This is actually a big challenge because we need to look at internal developments of our own countries. This is not in the DNA of most intelligence services, but if we want to understand the problem, we need to do that. We can help building resilience by, for instance, NATO is setting up advice teams that can be sent to countries upon specific requests, for instance, when we're dealing with critical infrastructure. We can pass a strong unified message. This is actually what was done at the NATO-Russia Council, which took place for the 7th time since Ukraine and Crimea just the day before yesterday. A very strong message by allies was sent to Moscow to stop meddling in our internal affairs. And we can respond. For instance, after the Skripal case, NATO got together very quickly afterwards and sent out not only a strong message, but actually expelled undeclared intelligence officers from as many as 150, more than 152 allies and partners, and the Russian mission to NATO was reduced from 30 to 20. So this was actually a very strong, concerted message. And I would end on a general note, modernizing the alliance in every way. We don't have a new strategic concept, but we are still modernizing the alliance in many, many ways, mainly since 2014. The budget sharing issue is one of them. The modernization of the NATO command structure, and dealing with cyber and hybrid threats, such as stating that Article 5 can be invoked even in the case of a hybrid or cyber and non-military threat like that. But of course, this is a purely political decision to define the threshold, and it will remain that. I think the key thing about NATO is unity and solidarity, and this will be the guiding principle for the future as well, I hope. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arndt. That's very good. I see a forest of hands already. I see Sven, Professor Schöpflin, James Scher. I think that was Lolita over there, Molly over there. and Anders just put his hand up as well. So it's going to be, I'm going to ask everyone to keep their questions really brief and to the point, and start off by breaking my own rule and putting in something that I think is not come up so far, but is really important, which I'd like all the panel to reflect on, and when you're answering the questions from the floor, perhaps also give your thoughts on this. That I really worry that we are just dealing with the bit of the problem we can see. The thing about information attacks is that they hit the public space sooner or later. And if we deal with information attacks in isolation, I wonder that if we're missing the whole point about this, which is that they are just part of a much broader arsenal, the Toxic 20, we called it at SEPA, because they very seldom happen on their own. It's usually, there may be information, but there's usually cyber, something kinetic, something on the economic side, so-called lawfare, abuse of the legal system, psyops, subversion, bribery and corruption, use of organized crime, all these other tactics. And I think we always need to think, when we're looking at the information dimension of what's going on, what are the other dimensions as well that were not, that are maybe not so visible, but maybe actually just more damaging. So Sven, you go first. Microphone to Sven, please. And then if we've got a second microphone, if we can get that to George Schöpflin over there.
Three short points. Thanks, a great panel. First, I want to defend the notion of a strategic ambiguity when it comes to thresholds of a non-kinetic attack. 9/11 is a good example. Civilians took a civilian vehicle and flew it into a civilian building, and that was deemed as an armed attack. You cannot put a threshold on that. You can look at the effects. And if you put a threshold, then the enemy will just operate just below the threshold. That's why you should not have a threshold on that. I doubt, Arndt, that naming and shaming really work, because that assumes that people you name can feel shame, and I doubt that. And then, Andrea, I want to maybe dispute one of the things what you said. I was also at this Cyber Woodstock Festival this week at CyCon and Munich Security Conference, Cyber Security Summit, and I would say that one of the takeaways was that attribution is a solved issue on a technical level. There is attribution lag, which is a problem because it takes time. But I think where it is not solved is attribution as a political issue. Because if you do attribution without retribution when it's just hot air, you need to have something coming out. So basically, no, WannaCry was attributed, NotPetya was attributed, and so forth. Question is basically retribution and basically political steps to be taken, political will.
Thanks very much. I like that. Attribution without retribution is pointless. It rhymes as well. And also, another very nice, naming and shaming works only if those you name feel shame. I feel someone should produce a kind of rhyming guide to information. George, have you got the microphone?
Thank you very much. Greetings to everybody. I only get 2 minutes in the European Parliament, so I'll take advantage of it. So really what I'd like to do is to turn the question round. And my question is, why is the West vulnerable? It's an epistemological question as much as anything else. I think there's been an erosion of authority on the part of the Western media, Western communication. If you like, there's now a dispersal of soft power. Think about Al Jazeera. In the bad old days when I worked for Bush House back in the 70s, it was inconceivable that anybody outside the West would actually listen to the sort of stuff, Radio Albania was pumping out, or indeed Radio Moscow. But today people do look at alternative sources. Well, why? Now here I draw to your attention to a rather obscure branch of knowledge. It's known as agnotology, the creation of ignorance. Big Pharma.
What's it called?
Agnotology.
Agnotology.
Yes, Big Pharma uses it, Big Tobacco, screening out areas. In other words, so that people don't know about it. It's not all about cognitive growth. And then the point that you've made often, Edward, the enablers, the people who make it possible. I mean, the city is the obvious place. But also, would somebody like to tell me about how Nord Stream 2 fits into this? I mean, there's a huge amount of money going around, and people are vulnerable to that. So it seems to me that what we're looking at is a very globally dispersed world in which the West no longer has a hegemony.
Right, thank you very much. And now James Scher, right next to you, just pass the microphone on.
Thank you all. I can't help recalling that in 2014 and 2015 in this place, our main preoccupation and our main worry was Russia's willingness to use armed force to change borders and to boast about it and to threaten more of it. What we've seen since then are a number of constraints. The Novorossiya project collapsed. Despite the mantra that sanctions don't work, there are real constraints in the modernization of the Russian defense complex. 3 years after the Syria deployment began, Russia is not in a position to say mission accomplished. The Wagner episode in eastern Syria, I think in many ways has been a quiet game changer. So my question is obvious. To what extent is this enormous proliferation of what we're calling digital misdeeds since 2016 a response to the fact that the military instrument now looks less attractive than it did a few years ago? Thanks.
Right, well, let's come back to the panel, and then I shall go to Lolita, Molly, and Anders next. Mark, do you want, don't feel that you have to answer every one of these excellent questions. Just pick the one that you most want to say something about. Mark, you go first.
Okay, well, then let me actually roll together, I mean, part of George Schöpflin's point and your question, and talking about the other factors which also links into the enablers. I mean, again, I think this is the point that I was trying to get at with that sense that if we focus too much on specific instruments, all we just simply do is just shift the Russian effort somewhere else. And for me, for example, I mean, we all talk about it and we all know it's an issue, but corruption for me is one of the most significant force multipliers available to the Russians and indeed to anyone else. I mean, again, this is the point. This is not just a Russia panel. The instruments, the approach that Russia is using today are available to a whole variety of other actors in the future. And, you know, I think one can look in a very different sense about, for example, what China does. And if you're looking in the Balkans, what Turkey does and such like, and there are some interesting parallels. But of course, the point is corruption is difficult because by definition, corruption actually is shining a light on the people in power rather than, those spotty alternative news media outlets or whatever. Attacking disinformation, dealing with disinformation is nice because it's visible, it lends itself to metrics, and what bureaucrat does not like something that lends itself to metrics. But things like corruption and the wider enablers are absolutely vital. And we need to be thinking about them now, rather than just simply thinking, okay, let's focus on digital issues and disinformation today, and then we'll see what comes along tomorrow. Because otherwise, all we are going to be doing is constantly shifting the dimensions of the campaign. So,
Andre.
I would like to talk about three things. First, about the West is vulnerable. Yeah, of course, you think that, but I remember an excellent piece written by Arthur Koestler, probably 1944, and he tried to compare foreign policy executed by Stalin and by the West. And it was quite obvious that Stalin was capable of doing much more, twists than any Western government could think of, just because it was, well, for Christ's sake, it was a totalitarian state. He didn't need to consult his parliament, so he could, one day he can send his people to Spain, next day to get to Ribbentrop. But the thing is, and of course it gives you a tactical advantage, but the thing is that on the way, Stalin lost most of his allies in communist underground organizations all over the world, and it was, in the end of the day, a big failure for him. And I think that's exactly what we see with Putin. Yes, he is capable of doing all these twists, tactical twists, because he doesn't need to consult with his society. But it doesn't mean it's a win-win situation for him. Remember what happened in Kazakhstan after 2014. That used to be a Russian close ally. Remember what happened to Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Everybody believed that it was such a big thing for the Kremlin to build up this regional alliance to counter NATO. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work. And maybe one of the reasons is because of these sudden tactical moves. And that brings me to an excellent point about response. I think it's really excellent. Because yes, of course, 2016 was a response to what happened in 2016. But to be honest, if you try to look at the Russian actions, all of them, it's about response. 2014, the annexation of Crimea was in a way a response to a failure, because Putin was desperate and he saw that all his political warfare he used in Ukraine before, sending his people to control the election, helping Yanukovych, completely failed. So out of desperation, he decided to enlist with green men and send them to Crimea. So it's always about some desperation. Sometimes out of desperation, you might get some real brilliant tactical solution, but you cannot build your strategy if you are always desperate, if you always think that you have some failures. And attribution, again, it's the same thing. Why do you think it doesn't work? We got, as I already mentioned, we got the biggest cyber branch of the FSB in complete disarray. Why don't we think that it's a strange coincidence? You got, the very first time in 2016, the governments in the West started blaming Russia directly. It started with Germany, United States, France, other countries. And then you got this, you got a big crisis in Moscow. I don't think it was just a coincidence.
Right. It's very, very interesting. I like the idea of the tactical twists, the way they've bust the SCO. Clearly, Russia is decisive in a way we're not. They'll accept economic pain in a way that we won't, and they're willing to lie about it in the way that we won't. But we should never forget the way in which the forces are so different from the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a serious superpower. Russia has the same GDP as the Baltic states combined, the Nordic 5 and Poland. Just 9 of the so-called frontline states, bigger GDP than Russia. And those countries have a defense budget combined of 40 billion. Russia's is 80 billion, but Russia has to run a space program and worry about China. And that, I think, is the real point, in a way, that if the moment we are seeing these tactics deployed by a country that's fundamentally weak and is doing them out of desperation, just wait till we see what happens when they're deployed by a country that is fundamentally strong. And if there's anyone here from Australia, do please pitch in on how you see Chinese information and influence operations happening in your country and the lessons for us. Daniel.
So just to start off with replying to what Sven said, I agree completely about the point on the armed attack threshold. And I think 9/11 is a perfect example of how we are now at a mismatch with the tool set that we have and the tool set that we need to answer for these types of intrusions. So for example, if you look at 9/11, that was a singular catastrophic event that was a rallying call and was deemed appropriate for this type of threshold and was met accordingly. But this is not the type of incidents that we're seeing over the last few years. We are seeing, rather than a singular catastrophic incident, we are seeing a multitude of significant but diffused incidents that neither one of them singularly falls under that threshold. So perhaps what I'm suggesting is perhaps we need different thresholds. And they don't need to be black or white. They don't need to be binary like we're used to looking at it. Are we under or over the threshold of armed attack? But it is a different thresholds for response. And if those are perhaps better articulated, we can have actually more of a tool set and more of a commitment from the participating countries in negating these types of effects at the same time. And to weave that into the point on attribution, I agree that attribution, I don't know if we can call it solved, but it's certainly much better. And nations routinely reach a high level of confidence in their attribution, including against very sophisticated attacks. And one of the best examples for this is the NotPetya attack, which was supposed to be allegedly a worm that rocketed through Ukraine and then broke out of its borders and started decimating the infrastructure for organizations around the world. We're talking about many billions of dollars in damages altogether. But what was the response to it? We had very high quality attribution from numerous NATO countries saying it was not only the Russians, it was Russian military intelligence specifically. And we've reached this level of attribution, we've reached this level of accrued damages, and yet there was no specific countermeasure to go after an incident like this. So So this is the point. And I think this actually weaves into why we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable because we are trying to meet a diffused campaign with a diffused response.
And if we could put the clock back to the point at which NotPetya was happening, is there anything we should have done differently?
Certainly.
No, I'm asking Arndt.
Yes, I think first of all, we should have been quicker in our analysis and then attribution of it. This took a very long time in the case of NotPetya, and this is actually a challenge for us at NATO, for all intelligence services to increase the speed and to really react at the speed of relevance on issues like that. So I would say increase the speed and attribute in this case. If I may make some comments on very briefly too, I think maybe the issue of the threshold is slightly misleading. I agree with Sven's comment. I mean, the definition of response will be a political decision. NATO has never and will never define a threshold because that could be exploited or undercut. So this level of ambiguity is absolutely necessary, but we have to deal with the challenge that you described, that this is a diffuse campaign with multiple attack points and not one big one. So this in a way is an unusual situation that we need to learn to respond to better. And the second point is, why is the West vulnerable? Clearly there are some challenges. There are many technical challenges. Just think of the Internet of Things, huge possibilities, but also that will make all of us, critical infrastructure and so on, more attackable, more vulnerable, or the bots on the social media. And so these are not completely new, but issues that will pose increasingly big challenges. And also we have to relearn deterrence in a way in response to this type of hybrid challenge. The alliance was very good at deterrence during the Cold War, faced with conventional military power or even nuclear power, but we are in the process of defining what deterrence will mean in the future, and I try to map out some of the aspects of that. But on a more positive note, I think we have been underestimated on sanctions or also on the expulsion of the undeclared intelligence officers. We have stood very firm for 4 years, and there has been a strong and unified response, so we are capable of doing that.
Right, thanks very much indeed. This is highly unusual for Lennart Meri to have an all-male panel, but we're now finally going to break the gender monopoly. First of all, Lolita, it is Lolita, isn't it? I can't see it. Yes, Foreign Affairs Committee, no, European Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. And then if we can have the microphone over there to Molly, the other microphone, and then I'll go to the lady in the front row here, and then to Lisa, and then to Anders.
Well,
go ahead.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for also ensuring good or better gender balance in this discussion. I would like to bring in another dimension, and that is of what is happening in Russia itself and what is happening to the hearts and minds of Russian people. Because if we are talking about the West that is being attacked, then of course the Russian people are being completely brainwashed by the official propaganda. And just to illustrate it, my friend had 2 visitors from Moscow just recently in Riga, and they engaged in very intensive Western cheese shopping in Riga supermarkets. And she asked, why? Why do you do this? Why can't you get this cheese in Moscow? And the girl said, because of Obama. So basically, as long as this thinking will be present in Russia, it will be very difficult to really fight it, because they will be constantly a demand to be fighting West was believe that the West is a culprit of all evils and so on. So how do we talk to the Russian people and persuade them that probably Obama is not the person responsible for them not having Western cheese in Moscow supermarkets?
Super, thanks very much. Molly.
Thanks. And I would probably just build off of what Lolita just said, which is great. I think there's this discussion, going back to the discussion of who's setting the terms and the language. I think in this regard, this idea that there's no real strategy behind these tools and tactics, that there's nothing we can do against Putin, that you can't possibly fight any of it, is exactly letting him set the terms. And I argue that that's the point, that is the strategy. The corruption and infiltration of everything is the strategy. If you make it diffuse and deniable, then this idea that there's nothing you can do about it and you have to shrug it all off becomes really persuasive for all of us. I think the point that Daniel was making, that they build tools and reuse them and keep reusing them, specifically because we are not fighting them and we are not countering them, is a really important one to listen to. They keep working and we need to fight them. We shouldn't wait around for Putin to die or get bored or wander off, because that's letting him set the terms, and that's insane when we know what the costs are to all of us. And the acceptance that what Putin's is his is untouchable is unconscionable, because people are dying for that assumption.
Thanks very much. Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Yes,
I didn't know
of
your
course.
name.
Nathalie Goulet, I'm from the French Senate. And I just would like to tell you that as a lawmaker, we feel a little bit hopeless regarding the subject. We try now in France to implement a regulation against fake news during electoral campaign, but it looks a little bit hopeless, and we are armless because everything will be ex post, of course, and nothing ex ante. So, in fact, the problem is in the title, because democracy, to fight against foreign manipulation, we have the freedom of speech. And at the same time, we have this manipulation. It's why we are so vulnerable, because we are democracy and we celebrate the freedom of speech. So I think that we have to emphasize education to media. And that would be maybe the key, because otherwise we will not solve the question of Obama and the cheese in Russia. So education will be a major point, I think. But as a lawmaker, we really don't know how to do, because no sanction and especially no ex ante capacity to solve the question.
So the forest of hands going up. I'm going to try and be fairly strict. So Lisa is next. Sorry, thanks. With 2 microphones. No, just one.
Lisa Past with the Estonian Information System Authority. And first of all, thank you for a panel where each next speaker answered the question I had to the previous one. Then my beautiful metaphor took flight, and then Sven Sacco made all the substantial points I had.
The metaphor was the one about that Russia is throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what spaghetti sticks.
However, I think we're running the danger of Putinizing ourselves in fighting Putinism, as you said, in definitional lack of clarity. When Russia talks about information warfare, it talks about all and any means possible to assert its influence that's non-kinetic. And then we think that, that's just misinformation. That somehow is lost in translation. Wherefore, whether you look at NATO or the EU or the nation states in this rule of law-based societies that we're dealing with, you look at 2 distinct things that were alluded to, but then got mixed, and we don't know what the baby and the bathwater is. Another metaphor for someone to take flight. The disinformation part, people understand better because everyone's been on Facebook and seen things they don't like. However, the real threat, and this is where the nation-state sponsor capabilities are so important, is that of cyber, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems. And whilst Andrei pointed out that the certain parts of the Russian capability are in disarray, well, those certain parts combined with the racketeers, the companies, commercial and criminal actors that work in symbiosis with the Russian governing structures trying to read their wishes, have penetrated the power creeds of several non-NATO member states, where clearly, and the attribution was already discussed, behind the most costly cyber campaign ever that affected at least 150 governments and nations and at least 300,000 systems. So all in all, as Lennart said, we have to relearn deterrence. And I want to passionately disagree with Daniel in that deterrence in this context is based on clarity. Deterrence in this context at this point is all about,
ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Yeah.
Is all about doubt.
Right.
Because we don't know capabilities. We partially believe they're in disarray, but then they asymmetrically take Ukrainians offline.
Lisa, we need a question.
Well, the question is, what deterrence is in this new? What is that unclear deterrence? How does it work?
Super. Well, that gives us plenty to chew on. So I'm going to come back to the panel, this time going from right to left. I think this question of what deterrence will look like is really interesting. One person from the intelligence community said that his ideal deterrent would be that when we're cross with Putin, we show it just by changing the ringtone on his mobile to the national anthem of a different NATO member each time. And this would send the perfect message and would be technically quite possible. I have no idea whether this is true or not. But I also think Molly's point about that one of the big goals is the projection of helplessness, the feeling that there's nothing we can do, anything we do risks Putinizing ourselves, so we're basically trapped. And that's very interesting, because this is a defeat that's really happening in our own minds. It's not there are tanks rolling down the streets of our cities. We've just decided that there's nothing that we can do and we're doomed. And that's a very cheap and easy victory. I'm going to go this time from right to left. Please pick up on any of the points that have been made, but please don't answer all of them.
I'll be very short, because I tried to answer this question before about deterrence, relearning the deterrence, and it's basically a multiplicity of issues, from strengthening our defenses, our resilience, being on top of the technological challenges, and I really want to emphasize Edward's point that we must not only look behind, but really see what's coming our way. And so this is, of course, much more difficult. We actually exercise this at NATO. This is one of the important points that we brainstorm and exercise this, but to stay on top of that is very difficult, all the way up to punitive reactions, such as sanctions or strengthening our military defenses as well, because of course a hybrid spectrum includes all possible instruments, military and civilian, that's sometimes forgotten. So I would say our main answer is actually to modernize the alliance at large, which includes the whole military modernization, but also responses to non-conventional and mainly cyber attacks.
Daniel, you were violently disagreed with. Do you want to respond?
So actually, I'm pretty happy I was violently disagreed with, because that's the type of discussion we should be having. But I think the point where a lot of the disagreement comes from is the notion that we don't understand necessarily this domain that's being operated in. And that's not necessarily the case. We have quite a bit of knowledge on what these operations can and do look like, including a lot of it that does not exist perhaps in the public eye, but certainly some of the top intelligence agencies have a lot of visibility into these operations. I don't actually think it is this difficult to conceptualize what an attack can look like and what it may or may not accomplish with reasonable certainty. Now, I am very much appreciative of the need to leave room for strategic maneuvers, and I'm not trying to suggest something that would obviously shackle NATO. This is more of actually creating a tool set. So perhaps threshold is not the right word, because that evokes some type of legally mandated response that NATO must respond on. That's not what I'm suggesting. If you want, we can call it even a taxonomy of the threat, if that makes more sense. Trying to actually conceptualize internally what an attack means to us and different types of attacks. And that is something that you can then build a deterrence model off. I understand the need to some level of ambiguity, but I also don't think it's as necessary as we have convinced ourselves that is the case. We have quite a lot of knowledge as to what these things look like.
Andre?
Well, regarding deterrence, I'm absolutely happy that nobody in this room ever mentioned cyber CBMs. Cyber confidence building measures, and I'm really happy because it was such a stupid and ridiculous idea to have a hotline just like we had in the Cold War and pick up a phone and call Moscow and say, look, we believe it's about you. And we know that it failed in 2016 spectacularly. So well, it looks like we got rid of this idea so we can build something new. Regarding this question about Russians and well, it's a very tricky question, and as a journalist, I'm not happy that we are losing our audience in our country, and it's quite obvious. I cannot deny this. At the same time, there is one particular thing which I do not like about this is that after 2014, Putin completely changed his strategy, how he dealt with the Russian audience. So before that, it was all about passivity of the population, and the message was just, well, keep distance from politics. It's all, well, give this government business to us and forget about politics completely. And after the protests, he needed to mobilize some popular support, and he started using very effective drugs. We got these things about the great superpower, we got this thing about Ukraine, finally Syria. The problem with drugs, and you can sort of keep your population on drugs, but, well, finally the problem is that people tend to get tired very quickly. And everybody forgot about Crimea in Moscow. Well, people sort of forgot about Syria, which means that you need some new drug, some new injection. And last year, lots of people in Moscow got really worried when Putin painted some of his tanks for the military parade on the 9th of May in white. So people thought, wow, probably it's something to do with the Arctics. So maybe that's the next drug which could be injected by Putin. And well, fortunately, nothing happened, but it doesn't mean that we need to completely rule out that one day Putin just decides, well, we need something stronger, and that's absolutely unpredictable.
That gives us something to think about. What are the future info drugs? Of course, they're not just info drugs, they're backed up by real kinetic operations as well.
Well, in a way, temporary, they got this thing with Skripal, of course, where they played this very skillfully, like we have the word conspiracy against us. And to be honest, it was really effective. It's the very first time probably in the Russian history, maybe Ilya would correct me if I'm wrong, Moscow voted for Putin. Like before that, Moscow usually didn't give Putin much of support. It was mostly about regions, some other towns, but not about Moscow. This time, Moscow voted for Putin. Basically, well, the explanation is that because of Skripal, because this case was played on the Russian media, and even the middle classes in Moscow decided to show some support to Putin.
Mark.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about deterrence. I mean, it is clear that I think from the Russians' point of view, their great strategic advantage over the West is essentially our lack of unity and will in their perspective. And in that context, I mean, what we have run the risk of doing is kind of inverting the usual speak softly and carry a big stick maxim into shout loudly but hold a small twig behind your back. So I think I'd like to say we should be much more aware of our own strengths and our own capabilities, but that involves actually being a little bit more, shall I say, imaginative in how we approach. Look, first of all, Russians, yes, they are exposed to an extraordinary amount of propaganda and so forth, but Russians have had a long experience of being lied to by their leaders. And you know, I think that they are no more credulous than the rest of us. We shouldn't assume that because they know what to say, and because there is a certain kind of patina of drug-induced, shall we say, sort of patriotism, that they are willing to see their lives ruined in the name of some grand imperial venture and putting Russia back on the map. Likewise, I mean, go back to James's earlier point. I mean, precisely one of the reasons why this is such a non-kinetic conflict is because of having, identified their own weaknesses. And again, this also links to Andrei's point about the fact that they are kind of lurching from crisis to crisis, and it's sort of a lot of this is driven by desperation. So, if we actually stop and think about it, I mean, our issue. If we're talking about sort of relearning deterrence, and remember, deterrence isn't something that we just have to learn. We also have to reteach it, in a way, because deterrence is useless if the other side doesn't work out what's going on. I think we need to be a bit more asymmetric. We need to realise that just because we have a tendency to think, oh well, what are the sort of the standard responses? I think we should be thinking in terms of, if we want to deter Putin, we need to respond in ways that precisely is going to affect Putin. Now, that might be changing his ringtone. That might be saying, okay, well, next time we spot you trying to meddle with an election, we are going to provide a great big aid package to Georgia to beef up its counterintelligence capabilities. I mean, whatever. It doesn't have to be at all kind of connected. We should just simply think about what will have an effect. Because in this respect, I think what we need to realize is that there is another race that we are at the moment losing, and that is an imagination race. The Russians, because of this essentially decentralized, entrepreneurial sort of style of governance, can tap into all the various weird, wonderful, often self-destructive and pointless, but sometimes actually very effective gambits and ruses that people come up. We have a tendency to be much, much more sober and sensible as we sit here in our ties, except for Andre. And I think we need also to tap into our imaginations rather more and find out effective ways of, to put it bluntly, yanking Putin's chain.
So NATO needs to have a new division which will be called Security, Intelligence and Imagination. Right, Anders was very patient over there. Was that you, Anders? Yes. You had, and then so Anders, then Dan Fried, and then Ina. And I think I'm probably going to close the list there if we're going to end on time. Go ahead.
Yeah, Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. I have a question about policy on social networks, primarily for Andre and Edward. As many here, I'm very tired of being attacked by Russian, or I should say Kremlin trolls and bots. And the question is what to do about them. I'm a great believer in transparency, which I see as the great asymmetric weapon of democracy. Shouldn't there be legislation prohibiting anonymous accounts and bots? I think you have argued that, Edward. But when I argue this on Twitter, I get answers from anonymous bots that say, sorry, I live in Crimea or I live in occupied Donbass, so I can't give my name to you. I support you. What do you think?
Okay, great question. Dan Fried, you've got the microphone to Dan, please. Ambassador Fried.
To follow up, Dan Fried, also Atlantic Council, to follow up on Anders's point, of course we have options to counter Russian disinformation working within our democratic norms. Transparency requirements can be enforced by governments. Governments can support civil society, the groups that are exposing and did expose in the case of the French election the Russian hacking attempts. The EU can be more robust in support of its own instrument, the EU Stratcom team. And if you want to get into the offensive realm, from NATO, you mentioned sanctions. In fact, Europe has introduced sanctions with respect to Russian aggression in Ukraine. It has not done so with respect to Russian cyber attacks or disinformation. The United States and the Trump administration, for all its wretchedness, has done so. They have done so. This ought to be something where the Europeans and the Americans are working together. And finally, if you really want to have an asymmetric response and push back against Putin's aggression, either through action or deterrence, start following the money. We have the capacity to look that up. You know, this is not impossible. It is intelligence intensive. but we can do it, and then we can let the Russians know we have the capability of doing it. The solutions, these and other solutions are out there. It's a matter of using them.
Thanks very much, Dan, and then Ina. Stand up, please. The microphone will come. Oh, you've got the microphone. Yes. Can you introduce yourself, apart from being friend of Elena, which is obviously very good already?
Thank you. I'm Ina. I'm from Moscow School of Civic Education, and following up on Madam President's yesterday's speech and the yesterday last session discussion and today's great analysis, I just can't help but bring one more dimension. When you speak about occupied countries and when you speak about freedom and when you speak about Russia as a threat, it'd be great if you also keep in mind that there is one more occupied country, and it's Russia that we represent, the civil society Russia, and all those people who are taken hostages in their own country and who are forced to leave the country. And I have to say that we're there, and we work every day to make things a little better, not only for Russia, but for international dialogue also. And when we speak to, we can't do that on our own only. And when Lena speaks to the foundations, and we speak to the foundation, and we seek for help, we hear that Russia is not a priority any longer, that Russia is a threat, that Russia is not interested anymore. So I just want to stress that we're there and we matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have a very, very quick question, like one sentence? We'll make it quickly.
Georgian Ambassador to Estonia, thank you very much, distinguished panelists, dear moderator. So I would like to very quickly bring yet another example of foreign manipulation, and picking up on forgetting, remembering remark. I'd like to say a few words about Georgia and Syria. Georgia, because we do not have, fortunately, open fire conflict and shootings and war, but Russia on a daily basis exercises its goal over there. In Syria, because just 4 days ago, it's the fifth country after Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Nauru who recognized the independence of occupied regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and Tskhin Valley region. And I would really love to evoke any kind of feedback and comments from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for reminding us of that. Okay, so I'm going to give the panel each 1 minute, and then I will answer Anders' question in 2 minutes, and then we'll be done.
Just very briefly, picking up on 2 points made, one by Mark. We have to be more imaginative, and I'd love to accept that new title of my division, and I'll take that home. We are maybe too sober and sensible, but this comes to the point of the panel. I mean, we have to be lawful and credible as well. So we have greater constraints as well, and I think this is absolutely fundamental. And some of the examples that were made show that they can actually work. So I think a credible media, credible democracy. This has to be the foundation of our reaction. And on Dan Fried's point. Totally agree. There's a realm of possible sanctions that we haven't fully exploited yet. Certainly, financial sector is important. This is not an issue for NATO, as you know. It's an issue for the European Union and others. One thing that we did, I mentioned, the expulsion of diplomats. Sorry, not diplomats, undeclared intelligence officers.
It could be an issue for NATO. I mean, it could easily be that NATO gets intelligence from its members and shares it with the European Union, and then says, right, this is a target. This is the bank.
The decision is not ours. Intelligence sharing is difficult between NATO and EU for obvious reasons. We actually have a lot of conversations, staff-to-staff talks, but we cannot share intelligence itself between the two organizations.
Conversations can have very wide meanings. Daniel.
I'll be brief. So even if we want to maintain ambiguity externally, we can, and I think this is something that came up repeatedly through various perspectives, we need clarity internally. We need clarity in what that means for the lawyers who are trying to articulate responses. We need clarity for policymakers who are looking to apply, and I definitely agree with this, the very vast and robust existing tool set towards the challenge set that we have. And this also applies, for example, to the problem of the trolls. There is a mechanism to deal with this, and botnets and troll nets continuously go down when the pipeline actually works. Twitter has the capacity to do this. Facebook has the capacity to do this. It's getting from point A to B and motivating them to do so against a threat that is perhaps the challenge. And I think we need to internally articulate ourselves better before we can approach them and actually facilitate what you're looking for.
Very quickly, I wanted to address this question about prohibition and some legislation. To be honest, I'm against it. I think it's a kind of overreaction because, look, we have this picture that because Russia is so successful abroad, it should be equally successful inside of the country, keeping things under control, especially online, and it's not. We have vibrant civil society. I'm really grateful for Ina for pointing this out. And the problem is that when you get this legislation, it backfires on countries like Russia. So you should be extra careful with these things.
I mean, governance and belief have become the new battlefield, really. And obviously, we're tremendously aware of how that is applying to us. But again, we should remember that this also applies to Russia. And therefore, I just want to kind of pick up on this point about Russians, that we should not regard them all as the lock-stepping foot soldiers of Putinism, but precisely as his first victims. And in this respect, I think something that we just need to consider is we need to make sure that we do not play, as far as we can, to his legitimating narrative, that all people hate Russians, that the world hates Russia, and that therefore they have to all sort of follow in. We need, again, insofar as it is difficult given the nature of the propaganda state, but insofar as we can, we need to show that we distinguish between the Kremlin, the elite, call it what you will, and Russians. I mean, this is why, for example, given that dubious Russians have no problem getting to the UK, I'm wondering why we don't dramatically ease visa restrictions. As I said, the ones we need to worry about, they get here anyway. So let's bear in mind that the struggle of governance and belief that we're fighting here is something that also applies within Russia.
Thanks very much. Anders, I'm going to just spend a minute on your question, because it is a really big one. When the internet was established, we didn't have Russians pointing guns at us, or Soviets pointing guns at us, saying, make anonymity the default setting. Always prize adaptability and convenience and innovation over security. That was a choice that we made. We did this to ourselves, and we've created the central nervous system of modern civilization in a way that is pretty easy for outsiders to attack. Now, it's had huge benefits, but it has had costs as well. So these are choices that we can rethink if we want. I think I'm very much against banning anonymity. I think if you deal with people who are campaigning in Tibet or human rights in any totalitarian or autocratic society, they really need this. And we've got to protect, I would argue very strongly, to protect the essential right to be anonymous. But I think it shouldn't be the default setting. And I think that we already have on Twitter, for example, the blue tick. We already have systems like DMARC when it comes to Gmail that allow you to see, to a fairly high degree of certainty, did this email come from the person who it claims to have come from. And I think we need a lot more of that. And as we're here in Estonia, I can't finish without praising the immense advantage you have if you have a distributed cryptographic infrastructure that allows you to prove who you are when you're sending an email, to check who the other person is, to send a message that only the designated recipient can read. That allows a much healthier sort of ecosystem. But I think we really need to push Twitter, Google, and Facebook particularly, and say, give us a healthy ecology. Allow us to prove who we are. Maybe you have to send a penny to Facebook by internet banking, and that will give you a special tick that shows you're someone who has a bank account. Maybe you have to send or receive a phone call to a landline. There are all sorts of ways that we know we can identify ourselves. Zero knowledge proofs, where you don't end up with them knowing stuff about you, but they know that this stuff exists. And that would allow us to shove the anonymous trolls and bots and so on somewhat to the sidelines, and we could say, look, if you don't want to identify yourself, I'm not sure I'm even going to read your email. Your email may never even reach me. Your tweet, my Twitter account may be automatically muted to everybody who doesn't have at least some degree of identification. And I think that's the way forward. So we've come to the end of our fascinating session. I want to thank you for your excellent questions. My apologies to the many great experts in the audience who I didn't have time to call on. You will have a chance to express your views later or over lunch. But please join me in thanking the panel for their insights and concision.